The south side of Chicago. I tell you, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I've got family history there to prove it. Think about it. My father's father, who worked as a draftsman for a company that produced bootleg liquor during the Prohibition, well, he got caught up in a shootout there with the police in 1933. In the 1960s, my Uncle John drove a meat truck on the south side until the third time he was held up at gunpoint by beef thieves. He later decided to move to Kansas City. Also in the 1960s, my own father himself wandered around the South Side projects posing as a Catholic priest in order to compile an eyewitness report on police brutality. Side note, his ruse fooled the police, but not the Blackstone Rangers, which was the big gang that controlled most of Chicago's South Side at the time. And yeah, that was probably awkward. Anyway, here's the puzzle I'm struggling with today. You see, the South Side of Chicago has changed a whole lot over the last 100 years. Yet at no point during this time period has it ever stopped being one of the most violent places in America. So what's changed? And why, despite these changes, do people keep killing each other so much there? Let's start with the question of geography. Recall from Thrasher that back in the 1920s, there were a lot of typical slums on the South Side, which, architecturally speaking, tended to be a mix of dilapidated 19th century era two-stories and makeshift shacks that people built with whatever materials that they could find. Now, jump forward in time just a bit. Between the late 1930s and the early 1960s, the Chicago Housing Authority, created in 1937, oversaw the construction of no less than 29 public housing projects in the city. Most of which were located on the South Side, including the Robert Taylor homes that you know from Gang Leader for a Day. Now, one of the main arguments for these projects came from the belief that the Thrasher-era slums, often referred to as urban blight, were geographically prone to high rates of crime and violence. The idea was that if you put people up in big, modern, respectable-looking apartment towers, well, that will give their lives some dignity, and so they'll have less incentive to lead a life of crime. Now, unfortunately, it didn't all quite work out as hoped. You see, most of the projects were intended to be for working folks, people of all races and various income levels who simply didn't have other housing options. But as I mentioned in an earlier video, after World War II, America's white working class moved to the suburbs, and for the most part, industry followed them. Pretty soon, higher income black families would also move out of the projects, such that by the early 1960s, the vast majority of those families still living in Chicago's housing projects were black and very poor, with about 90% of them reporting no income at all.
The only structure is provided by the gangs, who marked their turf with spray paint and set up sniper posts in high-rise buildings. The working poor Cabrini was designed for have long since fled, leaving the desperate alongside the helpless.
And by this time, the Chicago Housing Authority had grown old and corrupt. Not nearly enough of its allotted monies ended up going to the very expensive maintenance of these massive buildings, all full of poor people. Well, the result of all this? Kind of a horror show, really. The quaint, slummy blight of years past was replaced with a kind of post-apocalyptic urban landscape where poor black people found themselves trapped in giant apartment towers with no functional elevators and with broken toilets, where the halls and entryways were packed with heroin dealers and their drug addicts and prostitutes, and where the state affected almost no presence at all, but for the occasional raid by Chicago's notoriously brutal and corrupt police force, which at this point in time in the 1960s was almost entirely white.
What's it like living here?
Hell.
Why hell?
Because you don't know if a bullet gonna come through your window. You don't know while you're going to the store if you're gonna be shot at, or your children be hurt in any kind of way.
When was the last time they were shooting here?
Well, my building last night.
Now, by the end of the 1960s, it was very apparent in pretty much all of the United States that these big public housing projects, whose origins dated back to Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs in the 1930s, all of this had been a great and tragic failure of social engineering. And thus we see the start of the Great Demolitions. Many projects, like the notorious Pruitt Eagle homes in St. Louis, where I grew up, were demolished as early as the mid-1970s. Chicago, however, most of the projects struggled on for another couple of miserable decades, all through the height of the crack epidemic and the war on drugs, ever and always the epicenter of the city's violent crime. That is, until the mid-1990s, when both the money and the mission born out of Bill Clinton's sweeping 1994 crime bill, we'll talk about this more later, led to a decade of mass demolitions that made dust of so many of those antiquated monuments to mid-century modernism. And so it was, by the early 2000s, Chicago's urban geography had transformed once again. The big projects had been wiped off the face of the earth. But where did all the people from the projects go? And why is the south side of Chicago still so violent today? Well, as it turns out, most of those families from Robert Taylor homes, those depicted in Venkatesh's book, they stayed on the south side, but they moved into single-family homes and duplexes in neighborhoods like Inglewood, precisely where Harper High School is located. Recall the podcast on This American Life. Now, some of the Robert Taylor residents were given rental vouchers by the CHA, but most were left to their own devices, and so they found themselves scattered about in the city and living wherever they could find the cheapest rent, often living several families to a unit. It wasn't easy going for most people, is the point of this. But why has the South Side remained so violent? Wasn't the imposed geography of those monstrous apartment complexes a key part of the problem in the first place? Well, yeah, the projects were, in and of themselves, a bit of an obstacle to social integration, and that definitely facilitated the rise of gangs and organized crime. But, well, let's look at what happened. The bright side of things is that the demolition of the projects did help to take down the big crack gangs, which no longer had a clearly delineated geographical space to control. Changes in American policing and criminal prosecution, those that came with the crime bill, also played a big role in the demise of the big crack gangs. How? By introducing the wiretap into the investigation of criminal enterprises.
He's saying they're sold out in the low rises. So tomorrow they're going to start fresh with a new package.
That's what you hear? Listen again.
Low man strap, Joe.
Low man, meaning a low-rise pit.
You all the way down.
It's down to scraps on the last package.
But we going to start fresh on the latest tomorrow. Down from up north.
Tomorrow he's going to start fresh on the latest package.
Damn, how y'all hear it so good?
Now, thanks to these changes, the era of hierarchically organized, territorially embedded crack gangs, like the Black Kings of Venkatesh's books, or the Gangster Disciples as they're called in real life, well, they came crashing down to an end. And to be sure, these changes resulted in a significant reduction of criminal violence in Chicago, at least for a time. However, by 2013, when the Harper High School podcast was first aired on This American Life, the south side of Chicago had again become the epicenter of violence in America. Only now, it would be even harder to control than before. Why? Well, because now, these children of the last generation to have lived in Chicago's housing projects, well, they are now the inheritors of that violent legacy. Living in a place where prison is an expected consequence of adulthood, where guns are abundant and cheap, and where confrontation is the measure of one's masculinity. But also where the structured gang that used to be able to keep its members in check has now fractured and disintegrated into 1,000 pieces, leaving in its place a minefield of proliferating youth conflict groups. A place where gang induction isn't a choice and has no ceremony, but instead is the simple consequence of living on the block that you grew up on. The block that is now both the seal and the stigma of your identity. But what do you think? I'm Professor Michael Wolff, and this is Gangs, Organized Crime in the State and the Americas Online.
Soy el fuego que arde tu piel, soy el agua que mata tu sed, el castillo, la torre yo soy, la espada que guarda el caudal, tú el aire que respiro yo, y la luz de la luna en el mar, la garganta que ansía.